For more than half a century, Neil Young has stood as one of rock and roll's most fearless voices. He's never been one to chase commercial success or bend to industry expectations. Throughout his career, he's fired band members in the middle of tours, walked away from guaranteed millions, and created albums that left audiences scratching their heads. His voice might not be the prettiest or the loudest in rock history, but it's undeniably one of the most authentic. Young has always followed his instincts, even when they led him down paths that seemed commercially unwise. Behind that raw, distinctive voice exists an artist obsessed with purity and integrity, someone who has never apologized for his artistic choices. There are certain albums that shaped this uncompromising approach, records that Young held sacred throughout his career. These weren't just his favorite albums to listen to casually, they represented something deeper, serving as touchstones for what music could be when artists refused to compromise their vision. Each of these 10 records taught Young different lessons about artistic integrity, authenticity, and the courage required to follow your own path, regardless of public opinion. If you're interested in learning about artists who refuse to bend to commercial pressure and who chase artistic truth above all else, make sure to subscribe. We explore the stories of musicians who value integrity over comfort and evolution over stagnation. The first album that profoundly influenced Young's approach was Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home from 1965. This record arrived at a controversial moment in music history. Dylan had decided to go electric, and folk music purists accused him of betraying the movement. But Young saw something entirely different in Dylan's choice. He saw courage. He saw an artist refusing to be trapped by the expectations others had placed on him. The album itself was split into two distinct halves. The first side roared with electric energy, while the second side remained acoustic. Dylan wasn't choosing between these two worlds. He was claiming both as his own territory. This taught Young perhaps the most important lesson of his entire career. Growth often means losing some fans, and that's simply the price you pay for staying artistically alive. Songs like Subterranean Homesick Blues hit with the force of a manifesto, fast and furious with words tumbling over each other. Meanwhile, Mr. Tambourine Man floated through the air like a gentle dream. Dylan proved that consistency wasn't the goal, restlessness was, and Young understood that this restlessness represented a form of honesty. Years later, when Young himself plugged in and shifted from folk to grunge to experimental sounds, he was following the blueprint Dylan had laid out. The message was clear: never stand still, never apologize for evolution. Changing your sound isn't betrayal, it's survival as an artist. Hank Williams' compilation 40 Greatest Hits taught Young something completely different about music. Williams didn't simply sing songs, he confessed sins. Every note he sang dripped with the weight of whiskey and deep regret. Tracks like Your Cheating Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and Cold, Cold Heart weren't performances in the traditional sense. They were emotional wounds being opened up for the entire world to witness. Young heard that rawness in Williams' voice and recognized something of himself in it. Country music taught him that pain doesn't need fancy decoration or elaborate production. 3 chords and the truth were enough to create something powerful and lasting. Williams died tragically young, broken and alone in the back of a Cadillac, but his voice survived, fragile and haunting, continuing to reach new listeners decades after his death. Young carried Williams' ghost throughout his entire career. Whenever he sang about loneliness, loss, or roads that seemed to lead to nowhere, he was channeling that same honesty, that same refusal to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Williams proved to Young that vulnerability wasn't a weakness in music. It was actually the most dangerous and powerful weapon an artist could wield. Young never forgot that lesson. Miles Davis's album Kind of Blue from 1959 introduced Young to an entirely different concept, the sound of space. This jazz masterpiece taught Young something that rock musicians rarely understood at the time. Silence matters just as much as sound. Davis didn't feel the need to fill every single moment with noise. He let the music breathe naturally, giving it room to exist and resonate. Tracks like So What,
Blue and Green and All Blues moved with the deliberate pace of fog rolling across a landscape. They were slow, hypnotic, and absolutely mesmerizing. What struck Young most was that Davis played fewer notes than almost any other musician of his caliber, yet somehow managed to say more. This was a different kind of power from what Young had encountered in rock music. It wasn't about volume or speed, it was about restraint. Davis knew instinctively when to hold back, when to let a single sustained note hang in the air until it transformed into a complete statement on its own. This patience deeply influenced the way Young approached his guitar solos for decades to come. He learned to appreciate the long, sustained notes, the space between musical phrases, the refusal to rush through a moment. Kind of Blue proved that jazz and rock were musical cousins, both speaking primarily in feelings rather than just sounds. Davis taught Young that what you choose not to play can be just as important as what you do play. The Beatles' Rubber Soul from 1965 represented pop music developing real substance and depth. When this album arrived, the Beatles stopped being the cute mop-tops that teenage girls screamed for. They started being serious artists. Songs like Norwegian Wood, In My Life, and Nowhere Man weren't designed to make audiences scream. They were introspective, melancholy, and genuinely searching for meaning.
The Beatles had grown up in public view, and the world was now being asked to catch up with their artistic evolution. Young heard this shift and recognized it as permission to pursue his own growth. The album proved that you could be both popular and deep, both commercial and artistic. These weren't opposite goals that canceled each other out. What struck Young most was the honesty in these new Beatles songs. He particularly connected with Paul McCartney's musical approach and bass playing during this period. The Beatles were no longer hiding behind carefully constructed personas. They were asking real, honest questions through their music. Is this all there is to life? Where do I truly belong? The acoustic guitars were softer and more intimate. The lyrics became more personal and revealing. Rubber Soul felt like having a genuine conversation rather than watching a performance from a distance. Young absorbed this intimacy deeply. When he later wrote albums like After the Gold Rush and Harvest, he was channeling that same vulnerability and willingness to be personal. The Beatles showed him that artistic maturity didn't mean losing your audience, it meant trusting your listeners to follow you into darker, deeper emotional waters. Joni Mitchell's Blue from 1971 demonstrated vulnerability without any protective armor whatsoever. When this album appeared, Mitchell didn't hold anything back. Every song felt like reading someone's private diary without their permission. Tracks like River, A Case of You, and California were pure confessions set to beautiful melodies. Mitchell sang about love, loss, loneliness, and doubt with a rawness that made listeners simultaneously want to look away and lean in closer. Young heard that fearlessness and recognized a kindred spirit in Mitchell. He deeply admired her as one of the greatest artists of their generation. What moved Young most was Mitchell's absolute refusal to protect herself emotionally in her art. She didn't write from a safe distance. She wrote directly from the wound, still fresh and bleeding. Her voice cracked with genuine emotion. Her guitar work was delicate yet precise. Blue wasn't polished or perfected in the studio. It was completely real. Young understood that being real was actually the hardest thing for an artist to achieve. When he wrote songs like The Needle and the Damage Done or Old Man, he was following Mitchell's lead. The approach required stripping away all production tricks, removing the safety net completely, and standing naked in front of the microphone to tell the absolute truth. That took more courage than any flashy guitar solo ever could. The band's Music from Big Pink in 1968 reimagined what American roots music could be. While everyone else was chasing cosmic sounds and elaborate studio tricks, the band released an album that sounded like it had been recorded in an old barn, and somehow that changed everything. Songs felt simultaneously ancient and brand new, deeply rooted in tradition, yet pointing boldly towards the future. Young heard this record and found his own direction crystallizing. What struck him most was the beautiful simplicity of the approach. The band didn't need gimmicks or tricks. They had strong stories, gorgeous harmonies, and a groove that felt as natural as breathing. Robbie Robertson's guitar playing was understated and tasteful. Levon Helm's drumming felt loose and wonderfully human. Richard Manuel's voice seemed to carry the ghosts of earlier eras. This music wasn't about showing off technical ability. It was entirely about serving the song and the emotional truth it contained. Young absorbed this philosophy completely and applied it to his own work. When he made albums like Harvest and After the Gold Rush, he was chasing that same earthy honesty and unpretentious approach. Music from Big Pink proved that looking backward to musical roots could actually push you forward artistically, that tradition could be genuinely radical when approached with fresh ears. The Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street from 1972 showed Young that chaos could be refined into genuine genius. This double album sounded like it was constantly on the verge of falling apart, yet somehow it always stayed standing. Recorded in a French basement while the Stones were in tax exile, the album captured both lightning and filth in equal measure. Songs like Tumbling Dice, Rocks Off, and Shine a Light all felt loose, messy, and gloriously imperfect. Young heard that controlled disorder and found real beauty in it. What resonated with him was the authenticity that came from embracing imperfection. The Stones didn't polish away their mistakes in the studio, they celebrated them as part of the music's character. Vocals were sometimes buried under guitars, drums occasionally stumbled forward rather than marching in perfect time. Everything bled together into one magnificent blur of sound. This wasn't studio precision and perfectionism, this was pure sweat and instinct being captured on tape before it could evaporate. Young understood deeply that perfectionism could actually kill the spirit of music. Sometimes the very best recordings happen precisely when control slips away and accidents occur. Exile on Main Street proved that these accidents could be sacred, that roughness possessed its own kind of elegance and beauty. When Young later made albums like Tonight's the Night and Zuma, he was chasing that same wild energy, completely unvarnished, unafraid, and undeniably alive in every moment. Young's own album, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere from 1969, represented him finding his musical tribe. This wasn't just another record in his catalog, it marked the beginning of his partnership with Crazy Horse, a collaboration that would define decades of his work. Crazy Horse didn't play with technical perfection, they played with emotional truth. Songs like Cinnamon Girl, Down by the River, and Cowgirl in the Sand sprawled across minutes, roared with feedback, and absolutely refused to quit before they'd said everything they needed to say. Danny Whitten's rhythm guitar locked with Young's lead playing in ways that felt almost telepathic, like the musicians were reading each other's minds. This was spiritual communion achieved through amplification. What made the album untouchable was the complete lack of pretense. Crazy Horse never tried impressing anyone with technical wizardry or showing off with their abilities. They served the feeling, not the technique itself.
Guitar solos stretched past 10 minutes because that's genuinely how long the emotion needed to be fully expressed. Nothing was rushed for radio play. Nothing was calculated for commercial appeal. When Young howled through feedback-drenched guitar leads, Crazy Horse held down the foundation without ever flinching or pulling back. They understood something profound. Sometimes music isn't about showing what you can do technically. It's about showing what you feel emotionally. This collaboration proved that the right musical partners don't simply make you better at your instrument. They make you braver as an artist. They give you permission to stretch beyond reason and structure into something primal and absolutely necessary to express. Bert Jantz's self-titled 1965 debut album provided Young with his acoustic blueprint. This record arrived with virtually zero commercial fanfare, but carried infinite musical influence. The Scottish folk guitarist played as though his fingers held ancient secrets. Songs like Needle of Death and Angie weren't meant to be sing-alongs. They were meditations carefully carved from wood and wire strings. Young discovered this record early in his career, and it completely rewired his approach to playing guitar.
What captivated him was Jance's embrace of darkness. British folk music carried shadows and weight that American folk often tried to avoid. Jance sang honestly about addiction, despair, and wandering without any clear destination. His fingerpicking was intricate and complex, yet never felt flashy or self-indulgent. Every note served the melancholy mood. Every phrase deepened the emotional ache. Young absorbed both Jance's technique and his emotional palette. When he later wrote songs like Helpless or The Needle and the Damage Done, Jance's ghost hovered nearby, influencing the approach. Jance proved that an acoustic guitar could be just as emotionally devastating as any electric weapon turned up to maximum volume. That folk music didn't require cheerfulness or protest anthems to be meaningful. It could simply be honest, dark, and utterly human. Young carried these lessons across every unplugged moment of his long career. Jance showed him that sometimes the quietest records cut the deepest into listeners' hearts. Finally, John Coltrane's A Love Supreme from 1965 represented pure transcendence, captured in 4 parts. This wasn't entertainment meant for casual listening. It was a spiritual pilgrimage set to music. Coltrane didn't perform these compositions in any traditional sense. He channeled them from somewhere deeper. The 4 movements, acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, and psalm, weren't jazz seeking applause or commercial success. This was a musician reaching desperately for something beyond language, beyond structure, beyond ego. Coltrane listened carefully and understood that true greatness required complete surrender to your vision. What made the album absolutely untouchable was Coltrane's total commitment to his spiritual and artistic search. He wasn't hedging his bets or playing it safe for his career. Every single note was offered up as prayer. The saxophone didn't just carry melody through the air, it asked profound questions that had no simple answers. It wailed, searched desperately, and refused to settle for anything less than touching the divine. Young heard that spiritual hunger in Coltrane's playing and recognized his own restlessness reflected back at him. Coltrane's willingness to risk absolutely everything for artistic vision became Young's compass for navigating his own career. When critics savagely hated albums like Trans or Arc, Young didn't retreat into safer territory. When fans literally walked out during his experimental tours, he kept pushing forward anyway. A Love Supreme taught Young that artistic compromise was a form of spiritual death, that artists must follow their vision even when it leads into complete isolation. In fact, especially when it leads into isolation, because that's often where the most honest work gets created. This album represented the ultimate standard for Young: total fearlessness in pursuit of something larger than yourself and your career. Coltrane died still chasing transcendence, never fully satisfied that he'd reached his destination. Young has spent his entire career doing exactly the same thing, not copying Coltrane's sound, but honoring the search itself, that constant reaching towards something just beyond your grasp. That's what made A Love Supreme forever untouchable in Young's mind. Neil Young never played it safe in his career because these 10 albums collectively showed him that safety was surrender. He's chased the untouchable throughout his entire life, not because he believed he could actually reach it, but because honoring the search itself was the point. He chose integrity over comfort, truth over applause, and evolution over stagnation. These weren't just abstract principles, they were the lessons these sacred albums taught him, lessons he applied ruthlessly to his own work for over 50 years. That unwavering commitment to artistic vision, even when it cost him fans and money, is what makes Neil Young's legacy so powerful and enduring.